The following program was recorded last November at the National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas.
Channel 11 presents Talk It Over. Here's your host, Ellen Adelstein.
My very, very special guest this morning is the mother of the whole feminist movement, Betty Friedan. Betty, my admiration is obviously showing through in my voice. I can't keep my journalistic hat on. You started it all with the Feminine Mystique. How did you get on to that? What made you write that book?
Oh, well, now, in order to answer that question, you've got to read my new book, which is called It Changed My Life, and it's just out now in Dell paperback. And I do try to deal with that question, but the only thing I come to is that everything in my life brought me to the point where I had to write that book. And everything from my own education and my mother's frustration and my rather unusually good training as a psychologist, and then my work as a newspaper person myself, and then my life as a suburban housewife, where I'd been fired because I was pregnant. I had all this guilt anyway about working with, that we had in the 50s. And then I moved to the suburbs and was, avidly writing Housewife on the census blank and feeling guilty that I even wrote an occasional magazine article in the Women's Magazine. And then I realized that image that we were all living by in the 1950s and early 60s, which somehow did define woman solely in terms of her sexual relation to man, or in a kind of only in terms as a mother, housewife, wife, server of physical needs of husband, children, home, but not as a person herself, not as a person defining her own action in society. That did deny us somehow. Wasn't true to us. That wasn't true to our reality. That it denied certain things. And then I wrote a book based on my questions of other women and questions of how this had all come to pass, and based on my own truth, and it somehow managed to put into words what other women were feeling, and that's how it happened.
Were you surprised at how many millions of women, when they read your book, said, "She knows me, she's speaking for me"?
Well, as they said, it changed my life. That's what the title of my new book comes from, that thing that women have been saying, it changed my whole life, about the women's movement. But the reality of that change the last 10 years, which is what my new book is about, is not the same as the image of women's lib. What it really was, the women's movement as I lived it and helped lead it, is and even in terms of how my own personal gropings and fears and sort of the thoughts that all of us had as we go along, and the changes we have to make, some easy, not some so easy, some new problems, some wonderful relief, but the reality is so much, well, both less and much, much greater and more wonderful than the image of women's lib. And what the women here at Houston are just the living embodiment of it. And even though I objected a lot to this conference, I objected to the sense of government manipulation and that sort of thing, and the government kind of latching onto the women's movement. And yet the fact is that there are all these thousands of women, a much more diverse group than ever been before. How wonderful they are. I mean, and how wonderful this yesterday, especially it seemed to me the minority, when we dealt with the problems of minority women, and you found black women, brown women, and white women together as we never were before. They will never be able to say that this is just a white middle class movement.
One of the things that was so moving yesterday was when you rose to speak for the lesbian women. Why did you do that? You have been, shall I say, an opponent of the lesbian issue.
Well, I mean, that's true. I didn't deny it. I mean, I have, like any other woman of my generation, and I grew up in Middle America. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois. I got a lot of hang-ups on that issue, and it just made me mad when people try to equate feminism and lesbianism, or when lesbians seemed, and it also seemed to me disrupting and diverting us from our main goals of equality. And yet, I certainly am not for taking away or oppressing the civil rights of any group. And suddenly it dawns on me the way the right wing is trying to use that issue to try to tar our campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment, trying to inflame a false hysteria on homosexuality to block the Equal Rights Amendment. The only way to handle that is separate the two. the civil rights of homosexuals are an issue in themselves, and they should be supported because it is not the same at all, and it will not even be benefited, the homosexual, by the Equal Rights Amendment. Let's separate the two, and then, like any other minority group in the women's movement, you have to be for their civil rights. I mean, and that's it. And then stop focusing on it. It's not the main focus of the women's movement.
It has absolutely nothing to do with the ERA.
Nothing whatsoever. And that's the way to show it. But it doesn't mean you're going to sacrifice their civil rights in order to get the ERA passed. You're for their civil rights, but it's a separate issue from the Equal Rights Amendment. It's a separate issue. The issue like that of any other minority group of women, but it is not the main issue, which is equality. And that's the way to handle it. You don't fall into the trap set by the right wing. You do it from your own truth.
Why do you think people are so very hung up on homosexuality? Why does that almost synonymous with the word fear?
I don't know. Because let's face it, I'm pretty hung up on it. I don't know. It's not an issue that. Well, look. Who knows? I'm just not an expert on that issue. It makes me very uncomfortable, and I don't deny that it makes me uncomfortable. I mean, as I said last night, I'm a woman that maybe has loved men too much, not wisely, too much. Too much. And I don't dig it myself, but that doesn't mean that I don't dig lesbianism. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that I think anybody should be oppressed. But for God's sake, in America, religious belief and sexuality, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, is supposed to be private. So it's just a false hysteria to try to create a big hoop to do about it. And I don't believe them. I think I don't believe the right wing when, they are using that issue. They're using these fears and hang-ups we have to try to create a hate movement again. And I won't go along with that. That's all. I won't go along with it.
One final question that I must ask. I know at the time you wrote The Feminine Mystique, you were married, and a couple of years thereafter you were divorced. Do you feel that your libism, your movement, your leadership of the movement contributed to or caused your divorce?
Not really. I think that like some other women, finally I had the courage to get out of a very destructive marriage that I had been holding on to in great fear of being alone and of the stigma that it used to be a divorced woman in this society. And it was much easier for me to have the courage to start the women's movement than to get my own divorce. I assure you, I'm not that much braver than other women. I was very timid in my own marriage and went along with a destructive situation much too long. And the only thing that the women's movement did was give me more courage.